Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining me today. I can't thank you enough.
Well, my pleasure. It's yeah, our paths have crossed over the years here, and I'm a big fan of your work, especially with the work you did in Ukraine and the photojournalism you've been doing. So yeah, I'm very pleased to join you.
Yeah, thank you. So, for anyone that is tuning in, this is Gord Steinke. He is definitely a legend in our city of Edmonton, with an extended history in journalism, working as a news anchor for Global. Would you be able to give us a little background for the audience? What drew you initially to this career and what kept you engaged all these years?
For sure. I'm pretty old, so how far back do you want me to go?
Would love to get like a whole,
Okay.
journey of your story.
Well, it's kind of funny because a question I always like to ask prominent or people that had a career that lasted for so long and was, did you know that when you were a little kid that you were going to be doing what you were doing? And if I asked myself that question, I guess, yeah, I did. When I was in grade 4, I was one of those annoying little kids that would, I decided to start the school newspaper in grade 4. And I had a very good friend of mine, Tom Grummett is his name, went on to become a very wonderful cartoonist, and he did the illustrations in that thing. So I don't know how good it looked. My mom had a Gestetner that I never forget the smell of it. She would crank it out, and we did a school newspaper in grade 4. So my interest at that time was I wanted to, I was interested in interviewing people. I found other people were much more interesting than I was. So that's kind of how it started. And then I got into music. When I got into high school, and I found that music was sort of a good communication, a way to communicate with people as well. And that was a lot of fun. And I took that to the next level. And I ended up becoming a songwriter and a recording artist from the time I was 17 to 24. Ended up in Ontario doing the circuit, where you're playing 6 nights a week and a matinee on Saturdays. And I was songwriting and storytelling throughout that. We worked really hard for about 7 years on the road, and it was a lot of fun, but then I began to realize that that's not going to, A, it's not very healthy lifestyle, and B, it's not a very lucrative lifestyle. And it's like you win the lottery and you have a hit song and then off you go. But the stress level is amazing to try to keep that going. So I decided to call it quits when I was 24, and I went to university. I'm born in North Battleford, raised in Saskatoon, and I played all out in Saskatoon as well. But then when I went to Ontario, I decided let's go back to Saskatchewan. I went to University of Regina and got enrolled in their journalism program. And I was kind of an older student then, I guess, but I just took to it like a duck to water. It was, I just loved it. I loved everything about it. And I was worried because I didn't have great high school marks. I wasn't a very good high school student, but I did pass, and I was able to get in there. And I just took to it. And I had a thirst at that time. For knowledge and for learning. And I just loved everything about university, right? From, the entrance classes that you take. It was a 4-year program. But when I got into journalism, I absolutely I loved it. And I loved journalists. I found that the journalists were kind of like musicians. They were just the most interesting people in the room, and had the most interesting conversations, and they're funny and they're curious. They have an inherent curiosity about not just the world, but people around them.
Mhm.
So that this is what I'm going to do. Now, can I make a living at it? I had no idea. So I did get an internship at CBC Radio, and just absolutely fell in love with it. And so that's how I started. I got a job as a researcher writer on an afternoon drive show at CBC Regina on radio. And yeah, I just fell into it. I just loved it.
Amazing, amazing. And so, would you be able to walk through some major phases of your career that shaped your perspective? You had mentioned storytelling as being a huge part of it, and then you said that the journalists have been a major influence as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think that's the thing, that curiosity. Even as a kid, I was a voracious reader. I loved reading all kinds of books, from science fiction to Hardy Boys or things like that, and adventure tales of the Canadian wilderness, things like that. I just absolutely loved stories of just interesting people. That's how it kind of, I think that was sort of was the thread. It kind of just started my interest in journalism. It's a people thing. It's a communication thing with other people and connecting. I had so many good mentors. I remember I had great teachers at the University of Regina as well. I can just picture them like it was yesterday. And there was so many of them. Rita Deverall was the director at the time, and everybody was so encouraging for me as well, because I was sort of a fish out of water in one way, because I'd come out of a rock and roll band world where you're traveling all the time. You're not watching a lot of news I was reading a lot on the road, but there's, half the time the hotels didn't even have a TV in them. It was some pretty rough places that we were in. So when I came, I wasn't sure it was going to fit, but they made me feel welcome. When I got into CBC radio, I have to say that there was guys like John Veal and Barry Burgess who just were so encouraging for me, and I mean, I came out of a performer background, so you'd think that I'd be interested in that, but I was only interested in writing and researching and writing cue lines, question lines for the hosts. Then that was fine with me. But the funny thing was, one time I've been there for about 6, 7 months, and Barbara Nymark was executive director, and she came up to me and she said, she said, "You've got a pretty good set of pipes." She said, "How would you like to go on air?" And I said, "No, thank you. I'm not interested in that at all. I've kind of done my performing, and I really like just writing and researching, and then I do interviews, and back then you had tape, you'd cut up the tape, and then it would go on air, 4 or 5 minute interviews." And I thought, this is fantastic. This is all I want to do. She said, "Well, I'm sorry, but your researcher writer job is ending." So she said, "That's all we got." And I said, "Okay, when do I start?" So, I mean, I was terrified. I remember going on my first on air, and the guys are Dennis Grunding and these other hosts. Lindy Thorson was there. Right, they're hanging on. These people, anybody in Saskatchewan who's listening might remember some of those. This is a long time ago. This is back in the 80s. And I remember sitting there getting ready to read my first newscast, for example, and they leaned over and lit the script on fire. And of course, I put it out, and that took away all my nerves, and it was fun. That was the camaraderie that was there, and that means somebody had done it to them, as you're on an apprenticeship. So it was just a ton of fun, and they all just really helped me get through those days. And then I became a fill-in for a host, a drive host, and I just loved. You'd get like not just politicians, but and writers and authors, but you would get like no, I would find a story in like the Humboldt paper out in Saskatchewan, and then a crazy little feature about a guy named Joe Reiferscheid, and he had a problem with skunks in the town hall. And so he solved the problem by bringing a tractor in, taping up all the windows, and then he gassed them all. And that's how, and so I got old Joe Reiferscheid on, and it was just like, it was just an interesting, quirky story from small town Saskatchewan that painted a picture of what life is like. And so I realized that's pretty powerful stuff. And that was just radio. And it was after a while that I had been on radio, and then we called them suits, came in from upstairs, the management, and said, "Hey, you sound pretty good on radio. How'd you like to be in television?" And I said, "No, I hate television. It's so superficial. The clips are only, I get to tell stories here." And I was arrogant, I didn't know any better. And he goes, "Well, he says, if you cut your hair and put on a tie, you might go into television." And I said, "Well, I'm just not interested." And he goes, "Well, your radio job's ending, so
Yeah.
you don't have a choice." I said, "All right, so where do we go?" So I had a friend of mine, Andre, went and showed me how to tie a tie. I didn't even know how to tie a tie. I had three of them for the longest time hanging on a hook behind the door. And I got a suit jacket, and I had my hair cut. And then I started going into TV, and I quit the same thing. I had so many good mentors like Art Jones and Alethea Foster, and Gary Fowley was a news director. And there's so many people that everybody was so supportive of this gangly kid that came in out of a rock and roll era. And now he's going to be a journalist, and they were so supportive. And I did everything from entertainment news to did the weather, did some anchoring. I was doing a murder scene and some pretty, so government scenes with cutbacks of social services under the Grant Devine government. And so it was sort of baptism by fire. You just kind of did it. You had lots of vetting. Lots of people would vet my stories and say, "This is crap. Here's how you turn it around and make it good." And if the anchor read your lead, you were just like, "This is fantastic. I must have done a good job." And then so I did that for quite a while, and that was fun. And then I got a call. I got a call from American started calling. So because the satellite dish was up, and they saw me, and I had a lady named Anita Cleaver, who an ABC affiliate out of Minneapolis hired me. And Anita said, "You've got a nice clipped British accent. We'd really like to have you on the States here. We've got a competition for headline news and CNN out of the All News Channel." And so I said yes, and I was on the air in 2 weeks in the States on an international. So I went from local newsrooms to a national newsroom to an international newsroom, and I'd only been in the business 5 years. So it went pretty quick.
Hmm.
So I just never said no. If any young journalists are listening, I think the key to it was always be ready. You never know what's going to hit you, and just don't be afraid to just say yes. And if you fail, so what? It's not going to kill you. And
Yeah.
and and look at what happened. Just the doors just keep opening, and you just keep going.
Absolutely. I think there's so much to be said about the risks. And I think if you're in a position where you almost feel like you get pigeonholed, it it's like not good for your growth. So when the door opened, it's so crucial to take it because it clearly built this piece
Yeah.
by piece and your complete transformation in what you've created in your career. So you've probably witnessed journalism transform significantly. What would you say the most significant shifts you've observed?
Well, that's yeah, over it's 40 years now. So over 40, when I got into it, it was everything was pretty much there was they had just quit doing film for television, so video was in. And when I went to the States, there were so many different formats, but video was king. But I guess it's just the technology that's changed so much over what I've seen. And when I think back when I started and I went to the States, we didn't have the capability really for live television in Canada back in the late 80s. But as soon as I went to the States, that's all it was. We had huge satellite trucks that they could go anywhere. So I went from 1 minute like interviewing Pemmican Pete at Buffalo Days or the premier Grant Devine at the time, and have to do it in a tape. So now I'm down and on all of a sudden within 2 weeks, I'm out doing live hits and going into Miami and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles from a live scene. Some are reporting. So it was mind blowing to me at that point. And little did I know that when I was down there for a few years, and then we decided to come home. My wife and daughter were having trouble with the visa, just the same thing that's going on now, hiring Canadians into the America. So I decided, I'm not really sure if my visa is going to get renewed. So my agent had said, there's a place in Edmonton, IT. It's kind of close to your home. Would you like to go back to Canada? So we made the big decision to leave the States after trying it and then coming back to Canada. And I was at ITV for over 30 years, which was global here in Edmonton. And when I got here, they didn't have live television. But within a year, we had a live truck and a great crew of technicians who were running that thing. And so we were all of a sudden going out doing live hits. And I think that's why they hired me, because I was able to do that. I was used to it from what I'd learned in the States. And then that just took right off. So that went from you had to hit a satellite or a microwave tower to I remember reporting at the Pine Lake tornadoes. I just went out there with my camera guy and just the two of us, and I had a suitcase, and in that suitcase was a satellite. And so the technician opened up this. It's like the Blues Brothers with their brief. It's just a briefcase. Opened it up. We hit a satellite, and we were broadcasting from the Pine Lake tornado site the day after via satellite. So that was huge. And so it just evolved from there to the point where we were then on Wade Avenue for the fires. You go to the Millet Hotel, you'd be live. If it was burning down, you could do murder scenes, you could do fires. And that just opened up television. So that back then, there was no social media. Ratings were huge because there was nobody out there with cell phones putting stuff in. This was all the way it was going, to the point where I think Fort McMurray was mind blowing to me. We had a
Mhm.
special thing with the Fort McMurray fires, and I was in a ditch, and you could see the flames, and we were broadcasting, getting ready to broadcast into our 6 o'clock. And I was working with Global National. Some of their gear was there too. And then the police helicopter landed and said, "Get the hell out of here because the flames are coming," and you could see them coming up. So, but because of technology, we just picked up and went 20 minutes down the road. And within another 2 minutes, we were live into the 6 o'clock in Edmonton and across the country. So it was just absolutely amazing to watch how the technology changed. And that's the thing that makes you think, what's it going to be like in 10 years if that's happening now?
It is
It's
wild.
constantly evolving.
Yeah, the technology and how much it's changed over the years and how easily we can take it for granted at times. And I'd
Yeah,
imagine you've probably had to make do many, many occasions.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because it'll go down. It's technology. And so then it's frustrating when it doesn't work and you're at a scene of a breaking story and it goes down. Or you want to go to the ledge and get a news conference and you're going, when I was anchoring, then you'd want to go right to the ledge and and then it goes down. But you come up, but it's still just amazing that you can do that. Even if you're a photographer, even back in the day, I worked a bit with the Regina Leader Post as a freelance photographer. We were developing our own film. So you think about, they'd send me out on assignment. I'd take a 35 millimeter film with a Pentax, come back, have to go in the darkroom, develop it, pick the best pictures, and then use the darkroom. And that's long gone now. Like, think how easy it is. Point and shoot.
for sure. And people working long hours to deliver to ensure that they get the best product, either for
Yeah.
print or for live, the morning show, whether, or yeah, just in general, like
Yeah.
having to sell it. But
And now all of a sudden with cell phones and everything that you see, everybody becomes an expert and everybody becomes a walking, talking journalist where they think they are. And that's where the problem comes in is how do you discern between what's good journalism and what's bad journalism or what's just voyeurism?
yes, exactly, exactly. And that's where I'm wanting to lead into. It's how has media shifted in terms of trust and credibility and public perspective in the recent years? Because it's drastically changed even the last like decade.
In the last decade, yeah, COVID didn't help. At that time, there was so much information out. But I'll just go back to the guy that's south of us here is the president of the United States who keeps calling us fake news. And that's done more harm, I think, and caused more stress for real working journalists than anybody else. Like, how disrespectful is that? And he just uses it as a way to just other direct from something that's important. So by calling everybody fake news, he lumps everybody in. Journalists now have had a stress level that's beyond anything I ever had, and you're constantly fighting that. And then there'll be people in the audience who take him at his word, and it's become a catchphrase now, not just from him, but you hear it all the time. People are using it. Oh, yeah, it's just fake news. And these are people that have never worked in a newsroom. They have no idea what the daily whirlwind grind of trying to put a local newscast is together, and how these hardworking journalists that are in newsrooms to this day doing more with so many cutbacks. They're doing more. The stress level is incredible, and they're running ragged, and they're still passionate about journalism and doing a good objective job with lots of sources. And then you get people coming in and say, "Oh yeah, you must just be fake news." Well, that's so disheartening to me to see that. It just makes my blood boil when I hear
Yeah.
that.
And even when I think about how social media has increased drastically and the usage of it in general, like since COVID in the past 6 years, how much people resort to that source even of information and how disheartening that could be. And I do find it very interesting as well how a lot of these major news channels don't use social media and
Right.
they're completely separate from that.
And there's a very good reason. It's not their fault. It's because legislation changed. And then the owners of Facebook, Instagram decided, well, then we're just in Canada anyway. We're not going to be putting local news on or any kind of national news. We're not going to be doing reporting from a station. So it's interesting, just kind of an interesting aside. I remember when, they were teaching us how to email because nobody had done that yet. Right. So that was a big deal. My co-anchor Linda Steele and I sat there and said, "Is this thing going to work? It's really cool, but how long is it going to last?" And so that was the start of it. But I do remember when Facebook started, and they just started putting our reports on Facebook. Someone would just post it and put it on there. Well, the news managers and directors were up in arms. How dare they take our copyrighted stories and just put it on there? Because then they realize it's a big problem. No one's going to watch the 6 o'clock if you're watching, news reports, or even after the six ran, they would just run the 6 o'clock. Well, there was huge fights in Ottawa over copyright. And so that's kind of funny because in the last year or two, they've now changed it so you can't put news reports on social media. And that's in Canada anyway. I'm not sure about other countries, but they've done that here. So now then all of a sudden the news directors and the station manager go, "Hey, wait a minute, they're not putting our shows on anymore." So it did a total flip-flop. So the way they get around that now, which is nice, there's very smart people working in journalism right now and in the media, is they just put all their energy. They got great web teams to counter this, and they just put that on their own websites. You can go to CBC or Global or, City TV, and you just go, people have to learn. You can't get that. People are really up in arms. I don't see your report on Facebook anymore. Well, just go to the Global website and there it is.
Yeah, that's
That's how
amazing.
they got around it anyway.
Yeah, yeah. So, what practices and principles would you say have helped you stay grounded in truth telling throughout your career and what we're seeing now with the current forms of social media and information that we're gaining?
Well, for me, I mean, I always equated, for me, it's always, I guess, I've been grounded in that I always remembered just because of my past, I had such a variety work over, I washed pots in hospitals at St. Paul's Hospital, and I worked as an electrician, and then in a rock band. You meet lots of people in the bars and nightclubs throughout Canada. I think it always kept me grounded that my audience was always people just like you or me. And they are real people. And if you saw a car accident or if you had a murder or something, I always thought about,
Mhm.
I never wanted to sensationalize anything because I always thought about the mother or the dad or the brother who was affected because when one person, like my sister, was killed by a drunk driver back in the 90s, and I remember getting a few, even me getting a few media reports or a few calls asking for a comment on how I felt from a radio station. And I thought, wow, I would never do something like that. I just lost my sister. What do you think? How do you think I feel? That's the stupidest, So I was aware at a very early age in my career that there are ones, just because you're telling one story, it affects friends and family and coworkers, far and wide. So I think that helped me kind of keep an idea of who our audience was. And also it affected how I wrote the story and how I told the story. So I
And
think that helps.
yeah, I'm just thinking as you're saying that, I'm like still giving people their humanity, putting
Yeah.
yourself in their shoes while you're, considering the interview and,
Yeah.
still sharing that information, but in a way that still keeps the integrity of that person and what
And
they're.
yes, and remembering who your audience is. And sometimes on social media, you don't see that. People just want to be first and they just put on not knowing the context of what a car accident is or a police shooting or something that happened and just put it right on with no context and put it out there. And then it just takes on a life of its own and it's all misinformation and it's hateful. Like it's disturbing and it does no good for the psyche and sort of the humanity of everyone. There's no good to any of that. There's no context. There's no sources, and so it can be really harmful,
Yeah.
and it can be harmful just on your psyche yourself. People scrolling through this, it looks like young people scrolling through it just think, we have to. They lose all faith in humanity when they see this kind of stuff, and that's just the misrepresent. You're looking through a distorted lens of somebody who thinks it's cool to put out the worst of the worst out there, and and those people can't be censored, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's so much information that's taken out of context, and I do wholeheartedly agree it does take a life of its own. And so, being constantly bombarded with content and opinions and a wide array of news sources, how do you think emotional currency when it comes to how we consume and share, what is worth our investment, our energetic investment?
Well, I think less is more. I think the less you're scrolling through your phones and checking out news feeds from suspect sources, and taking in all this information, I think the it's nice to take a step back every now and then, and because you can just get caught up in that whirlwind of just constant. It just you're just flipping through, and I don't know how your brain can even take it all in. The attention span is getting less and less that I've read about in some of the reports, and also it for some media outlets trying to keep up with it, the clips and the stories are getting shorter and the clips that they're using. I used to get upset when they said you can't do a clip under 2 minutes. And now,
Mhm.
you can be down to 20
Right.
seconds. So what kind of value are you getting out of that? And the other thing that's taking away too is it's kind of a little bit off topic, but there's franchise journalism has gone because there's great journalists working in all our newsrooms right now, and they're very passionate about it, but they're trying to do too much with too little. And what they're doing is burning people out. They've got reporters that are not just lining up the stories, they got the reporters going out shooting the stories, then coming back, editing the stories, and then writing them out. And then there's always, when you get that fast, there's always a recipe for disaster that you're going to get something wrong. So the whole cycle our whole society has just sped up in the last 10, 15 years. We're just on a high speed treadmill going nowhere, bombarded with all this stuff. And you just got to, I think personally, I've stepped back from it. And, when I was working there in full time, you had to do it. That was part of your job description. You got to post something on Instagram, get something on Facebook, talk about what the story is you're doing coming up. But that makes sense. You're promoting your job. But just to go out and start saying, here's what I had for dinner, just doesn't make any sense.
I know I keep thinking about how interactive we are in social media, and I've naturally almost used it as a source of education. And this is a big thing that keeps popping up for me because I think pre social media, we had Google search. And then
Yeah.
pre that, we would go to libraries or we'd actually have conversations, we'd actually converse. And I think it displaced a lot of the professionals and a lot of our elders that may have a lot more wisdom. And so we think about how we're like just flipping through our phone, going through this endless cycle of content,
Yeah.
getting this synthetic dopamine that's not really educating us, but just taking all of our energy.
It's
We kind of have
entertainment.
to, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
for me, I'm thinking we just need to evolve into the next phase. How are we sourcing that? And for myself, I really tried to stop myself in my tracks in those moments. And I try to like flip to a podcast where maybe I'm seeking education or something more of a positive
Yeah,
impact where I can better my life as opposed to just feeding into that, the
yeah,
no, it's like trending and it's fun, but it's like it's not I find that it's not satiating us. It's not
yeah.
nourishing us, you know?
Right. And I still have an incredible faith in humanity because what I've learned is over the years that I never, somebody came up to me and I was in an event last month and somebody came out and they're following me as I was going out and they're going, well, what's the worst interview you ever did? I mean, it's easy to talk about the best interviews that I've learned from and they stick in your mind forever, right? The people that had an impact on you and who time and it was a good interview. But this guy was asking me, what's the baddest interview you ever did? And I had to, finally I looked at him, I said, I can't think of one because every time I interviewed somebody, I found something there that I could learn from or talk about. I even did a 5-part series in the Edmonton Max, so I talked to the worst of the worst. I was in their cells and talking to them about, there some of them were mass murderers, and I hate to say it, but even some of them. One guy went, "Well, yeah, I'm in here for a long time, but I wired the satellite system in here. They put me to work and stuff, and he they would actually there would be some kind they would start talking about their mother or their kid that was out there. And usually it was a drug problem or mental health problems that you'd learn. So you learn something from everybody, even sort of the worst of the worst have something to say.
Mhm, mhm. This is another thing too I had in a recent interview. We were talking about bias as well and how we're finding more often than not that like there's so many different forms of truth. And even just as you're talking to
Yeah.
this gentleman, yeah, of course he's made choices that he has to handle for the rest of his life. But when you peel back the layers, it's very interesting how there's so much in regards to education and people
Yeah.
telling their
It's not
story.
black and white.
Yes. Yeah.
It's just like I did a story on a series way back on the homeless when the homeless problem was starting to get bad. And at first, people would drive by and go, "Oh, what a problem! Get what a bunch of bums. They should get a life and all that." And once you start talking to some of the homeless people, you put a face to them, you realize they just like many of them had a run of bad luck, or they have addiction problems, or they have mental health issues. But some of them had amazing stories and families, and they just ran out of they were just at the end of the road and stressed out, and they just didn't want a 9 to 5 like everybody else. And that kind of made me change about give them empathy and that some of them that were out there didn't deserve their fate. They were just trying to make the best of what they had,
Mhm.
and it's when you get in and start talking to people and then you hear the other side of the story, like I said earlier, nothing is black and white. Everybody's got layers like an onion, and not all those layers are bad.
One of my favorite channels that I watch is it's one called Soft White Underbelly, and
Yes, I watch that too. Yeah.
yeah, and it's got some grit, it's got some rawness to it, but I appreciate it because you see that human being, whether in the midst of, their addiction or being trapped in a situation,
Yeah,
but you really get like a clear picture.
for
It's
sure.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily PG for,
No, no.
it's definitely for adults, but it definitely it tells a lot about people and kind of the state of society, and it kind of makes you rethink about how we look at people with addiction and on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. And the interviewer is great because it's the kind of journalism, kind of gonzo journalism I've always been a fan of, is that he stays out of the story. You just hear a question from him every now and then. He's not on camera. So I love that kind of thing. So that's the thing that the difference between a good journalist and a bad journalist is a good journalist keeps himself out of, or herself out of the story and is completely tries to be. It's impossible to be completely objective, but they keep that in mind while they're telling the story. And then you get as many sources as you can, and then you let the audience decide. That's to me is how I was trained as a journalist.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
what kills me is when you go on social media, and then there's people criticizing journalists, and they, like I said, they've never been in a newsroom, they have no idea how journalism works. They just don't like something, and they're just the most hateful, mean. You can get one nice comment, and then you'll get like 10 of people weighing in on. And it's like, we all have, I think, thin skin. People say, well, have to have thick skin. Well, during COVID, I really began to get thinking nobody was with us because all we got was if it wasn't people protesting around the station or sending you hate mail, because you're pro-vaccine or something. We're trying to tell both sides of the story too. We get doctors on. We're in the middle of COVID. Nobody knew what was happening anyway, and everybody decided that they, or not everybody, but some people decided they knew better than the scientists and the nurses and the doctors, and it became politicized. It was just, it was mind numbing.
And that's where I keep scratching my head when I think about, is it a matter of sharing truth or is it a matter of shouting the loudest, being the loudest in the room?
Right. That seems to be what's working now. If you can just go on and just shout the loudest and, sound like you know what you're doing, even though you have no clue what you're talking about, just kind of like put a little hate on it. And then people seem to gravitate to that. Unfortunately, back in our day, it was like someone would call the newsroom if they could get through and complain about a story. And if we were wrong, we would go on the next night and say, sorry, we got our facts wrong. And that's a good thing about a good journalist is you have to admit when you're wrong. And hopefully it doesn't happen too much, but we're human. It happens every now and then. And then it's just that everybody's a critic now because you get bombarded with from a million different sources that's out there. So everybody's very accessible. So in a way that's good because we'll get tips on stories that are happening even before the police will get there. So we can get there and tell people, watch out what's happening in your community. But at the other time, it's pretty frustrating and it's just disheartening to see how much hate is out there
Absolutely.
at all levels. For some reason, I never, maybe there were people like that 100 years ago. They just didn't have any way to tell you. Guy just yelling on the street corner like the town crier, but now everybody's an armchair expert.
I always love the analogy. I went and saw John Cleese live. I think it was like 4 years ago. It was like kind of in that lull of the summer during COVID when we had everything lifted. There was a little minimal restrictions. And I remember he said that, he remembers a point where people would speak on podiums and have a debate and they'd
Yeah,
walk off stage and they'd shake their hands. And that
right.
doesn't seem to be the theme that we're
No,
seeing.
no, you got that right. I know. I think about my grandpa. They would have quite heated discussions in the pub in Tisdale, and they'd be in the corner and they'd be having quite a heated discussion. One would be, I'm for Diefenbaker and whoever the opposition was at the time, and they would talk about it and have a heated argument. But then, yeah, the next day they all drove home together and they wouldn't bring it up again. So I was always brought up that you don't talk politics to strangers. And you barely don't talk politics around family gatherings. But now, can you imagine Thanksgiving and Christmas and in some in some households, it'll just be a war zone,
Yeah, absolutely.
and it's splitting families apart, unfortunately. We've
It
become
is.
so politicized.
It is. Yeah, and what I'm seeing now too, I'll give a quick example, and I think this is really important, is what I'm noticing, and a lot of stuff that's public now is even with the algorithm, you look and there be an example of, let's say it's like a girl cooking her boyfriend dinner. And if,
Right,
me being a female, I look at the comments and it all shows a female bias that's very negatively shadowed over the boyfriend. But
right.
if the boyfriend or a male were to look at this exact reel based on his algorithm, it would paint a completely different picture of the information because the males would paint a negative light on the female
So
based
how
on
do we
this.
how are you supposed to protect yourself from these algorithms? Every time you sign on to social media, you don't have any say about what these things are doing or where they're guiding you to. So how do is it there's no app that'll get rid of them? What do? You just have to be conscious of you're being tricked constantly.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to lead to. I think about like how do we maintain critical thinking and discernment with all of this constant noise of content that
Yeah.
we see on a daily basis because it's part of our lifestyle now.
Yeah, and think about the added level of pressure that puts on newsrooms to do that. I know even just now I'm out of the media, of course, but I mean, even I'm a news junkie still. I still get up in the morning and I read. But if I see something that looks suspicious, what I'll do is I go to my sources like Canadian Press or AP or Reuters or that kind of thing, and I'll go right to it and just fact check because they've fact checked everything as well as they can. So you can go to some of those to try to keep it real and to sift through the weeds of all this misinformation that's there. I still go to the top notch, news organizations because they're still dedicated journalists and they're well trained. And I always say it's like being an electrician. If you go into the trade, you're taught how to wire a house one way. There's one way to do it. And that's the same way with journalism. We're taught to try to be as objective as you possibly can. You got to put that out, get all these sources that you can on both sides of the story. If it's a government story or police story, whatever, social services story, get all the different sides and then put it out as fairly as you can, and then let the audience decide.
Mhm.
But then I always get a kick out of people who go, "Would you go in if you just just one of these haters and go in and say, 'Hey, I don't like the way you wired that house,' knowing nothing about being an electrician." That's what's happening.
Yeah.
He doesn't like you personally, or she doesn't like you personally. So then what they're doing is just criticizing the job you've done just because they don't like you. And that's
Yeah.
what's happening a lot with the criticism in journalism too.
I know, and that's why I keep thinking about how, like, it's a scale, you know? I think having a open mind and a level of curiosity in so many different areas always leaves room for you to either, have your own discernment, but always maybe have the opportunity to reevaluate.
Right.
But you know,
You
as
have
much
to
as
have
I
critical thinking is what it's about. Don't believe everything you see. Like, criticize it, research it yourself.
Yeah, yeah, always be willing to explore and do your research. Yeah. Would you be able to share a time listening to maybe an unexpected angle or perspective that completely changed your understanding of a story?
Well, I think that goes back to what I did. I did stories. Well, I kind of did stories well with the prisoners, but I also in finding out why they were really there, and then you find out about their background and stuff. But the homeless, I think, was a real eye opener for me as it became bigger and bigger. Like I had said, once you get to meet some of these people, it's really changed my. I had a lot more empathy for what was going on, and I realized it's not just a bunch of people that don't want to work, and but there was a lot of addiction problems and stuff. And I've also seen people come out of those problems and find housing. But man, we've got a problem with that, and we have a real addiction problem, and it's not just here in Edmonton. You go to San Francisco and you got to be careful where you're walking because unfortunately there's a lot of violence there as well. And that never used to be there. But those kind of stories would be the ones that really opened up my eyes, and also the personal tragedies and things that I saw. I covered the Mayerthorpe Mounties. It was a huge tragedy, and that was a story that went on and on. And I got to know the families of the men that were assassinated, that were killed, and we still reach out and touch base sometimes because you get to know these people, and it's not just a news story. It's not just a story, and the next day, the way the news media works is you do the story, and the next day, okay, now what are we doing? And so you have to. It's a whole new newscast the next day. You got to get another. But some of those stories stay with you forever because it affects so many people, not just the audience, but the people that are actually involved. So that was a tough one. There's a lot of tough stories, and people who lost their homes in the Fort McMurray fires, the Pine Lake tornadoes, the people that died in that. And you see those kind of stories and you wonder where they are now. I still think about them. I was interviewed on a segment of Crime Beat, and we talked about a story I covered, um, 1992, on the murder of Punky Gustafson. And that's over 30 years ago. And that was tough to talk about because, you can see that the family is still so horribly affected by that gruesome story that it is. It's a terrible story, but it's a story that shocked all of Edmonton and all of Alberta actually while they look for the killer. And yeah, it was those things they're still tough to talk about. But every time you did one, the next time you did a similar story, you kept in mind that the family and the grandmothers and the brothers and sisters and the teachers were watching, and they'll never be the same again.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that's the way it goes.
I just think it's so interesting with some of these stories of how it has an emotional currency and how it has a ripple effect and how it affects community. And so having the power in your hands to be able to tell that story and raise awareness and create that impact is so powerful.
Yeah, it was, and that's the thing that I wish there was. I was thinking while I watched that episode of Crime Beat, and I was thinking it's kind of sad that there isn't that enterprise journalism anymore. That journalism, that style of franchise journalism, where you go over and above what you do every night at 6 o'clock for the newscast. That kind of enterprise journalism has disappeared, and that goes like in that particular case, we actually teamed up with CTV and ITV. They were the sworn competition and ratings. The TV is a hugely competitive business, but we actually teamed up for an hour show to try to generate tips and talk to the police and everybody. And so that was quite I haven't seen anything done like that quite before, and it would never happen today, I don't think. And the same thing with we used to have a troubleshooter franchise where people got ripped off by a car dealer or a scam. You could come and call the troubleshooter. City hall beats, legislature. Now they just, they send out, generally it's a different reporter all the time. So you don't really get a sense that there's a fluid thread going through all of the stories because it's the same franchise that's covering it, knowing what you get. So I mean, I used to do a thing called Your Town. I was the luckiest guy in the world. My whole career, I was just so fortunate. I just felt like one thing led to another. I don't know how it happened, but I had a wonderful time over 30 years in media. But I had a segment called Your Town where they actually let me go out, and I would just head out in the morning and go to a town like Denelda or Stettler or Lac La Biche, and I go to the town like the mayor, and you talk to some of the locals that had been there the longest, people from the museum, and the common thread was you got to know the history of the place. You got to know that the immigrants came into these towns from Sweden. These ones were Ukrainians. These ones were Germans, and they kept that fabric, that color, that history. They were so proud of it that it shone. So that series ran, I think, for 4 years. I think I went to over 60 towns, and each one was so different. And that was a huge, but now that kind of journalism is gone now. It's a feature. It was at the back end of the news, but people look forward to seeing it. And it was nice to showcase these wonderful communities that we've got in Alberta. Those communities are all across Canada. And those people all just so proud of their history, which I just fell in love with.
And so now with the increase in independent podcasts
Yeah.
and alternative media, what do you think traditional journalism needs to learn and adapt, or how do we merge the two?
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to see them merging. I think what I'm seeing is what they've done a good job is they all have web teams so that they're trying to, the old school people that want to go and watch the 6 o'clock newscast. But in this day, everybody's so busy. You got kids soccer, and so I can't be, they can record it. But do they really go back and watch an entire six and zip through the commercials? So what they've done, they've got the web teams, and you can go on a website like Global Edmonton and or CBC or CTV, and you'll get a nice snapshot of what the important stories are any time of the day on your phone. So I think that's a way that they've sort of amalgamated both beasts and try to make peace with the enemy and do it. I think that's the best way right now. Everything being off social media, I don't know if that'll change with legislation coming up or what that's going to look like in 5 years. But to get around it, it just takes an extra step. You just got to get off your social media and just go right to the website, and then you can do it. So I think they've done a pretty good job at that. One problem I've noticed, this has happened since I left, is politicians now seem to be going around mainstream media, circumventing it, and just putting their messages out on like Facebook. So it doesn't give journalists a chance to go and like, wait a minute, what are these cutbacks to Aish? What do they really mean? They don't have time. It's out there and they just put it out and boom, there, take it for what it is. But there's no criticism, there's no critical thinking going on, and there's no reporting about the ramifications of what these changes actually mean. So that's a bit of a problem. And I think that keeps journalists today hopping is they have to keep watching all these politicians' news feeds because they're not, in the old days, they'd call the newsroom or send you a fax or send you an email and say, hey, we're going to induce this bill. Would you like to give us some coverage? Well, of course we would. But at the same time, we're going to say, but on the other hand, we'll have a critic coming in to say what's maybe not so good about it. That kind of critical journalism is sort of going by the wayside if they keep going around that way and just putting stuff out on their own personal page. I
Right.
see that as being a bit of a problem because journalists always have been we're watchdogs of guardians, of our institutions. That's what the whole point of being a journalist is like that's what they do. They're watchdogs and guardians and gatekeepers, if you will. And that's kind of going away now because who needs a gatekeeper when the gate's always open?
Yeah, and really just trying to tell once again the true story of what's happening. And obviously sometimes how we receive news, it can be heavy, and it's not always, there isn't always the silver lining, but it's the gatekeepers of telling the actual truth of the matter so that the world can hear it. I think just having that critical eye, that just in knowing of constantly analyzing, doing your
Just be a
research.
yeah, and just for viewers and listeners and if consumers of media and news media, just always have a critical eye out because is this real or is this not? You can pretty well tell pretty quick, but I mean, that's because I worked in it for close to 40
Mhm.
years, so what's going on. But, yeah, for somebody who's, like, say, an 18-year-old and just looks on their phone, it's like, "Oh, that's gotta be real. There's a
You take it
picture
at
and there's
face
somebody
value.
telling me this is what's happening." So
Absolutely.
but you still need to it's nice to have people out there with their phones and capturing, incidents to warn people out if there's a traffic accident but also to show us what's going on in Palestine right now too. I mean, there's a lot of video that we wouldn't see otherwise if it wasn't for people there bringing it back to show us the destruction and the carnage that's going on as well. So it's got its plus points. Those kind of things weren't around in World War II, and then you just had to go to three networks basically to get the information about what was happening on the battlefront.
Yeah, and then just obviously being mindful of how it's shared. Yeah, so it's not misconstrued or taken out of context. But what gives you hope about the future of journalism and media?
Well, I think it's the people. I've been mentoring a few reporters, young reporters, some older reporters, but I'm really pumped. We need good journalists right now more than ever. With everything that's going on in the world, with the division and with politicians are trying to split everybody up and always fighting and always negativity coming out of them. You couldn't, in the old days, I mean, you would have governments in Canada, like the Liberal and Conservative government or the NDP, at least they would agree that, yeah, let's work together and improve our healthcare. Now it doesn't matter what would happen. It's just no good. It's just like black,
Hmm.
white. Everybody's disagreeing with everybody. They just want to disagree. So it's very argumentative. And I think the thing that gives me hope is that there's such passionate young people out who want to learn how to tell a good story and how to be, objective when they tell the story. They want to be observers, maybe not so much participants. That's the way I was. I'd rather just be an observer and watch what's going on and make my own opinions up about it. And the good news is that those people are out there and they care. The thing I worry about is I go, oh my God, you're being asked to do so much, especially in TV right now, but even in print. Being asked to do so much. You shoot the story, you come back, and I'm worried too that some of the vetting that went on in my day, you had two or three producers looking at a story and then tell you, well, you better fact check this and stuff. Now I'm seeing that the need to get that story out so fast and beat social media might be mistakes made, but I think I'm optimistic in that the passion for good journalism and good journalists, it's out there, and it's a noble profession still, and it's needed more than ever.
Really trying to provide that quality to, the world and to audiences. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And just the fact that technology has advanced so much, it's pretty incredible how we have the ability to be able to document and share and preserve our history and tell
yeah,
greater stories. So, yeah,
yeah, and that storytelling that there are people that they're born to be storytellers like you are. And, you just carry on and I don't know where it's going to be in 10 years, but I'm optimistic that things are going to be better because the pendulum's got to eventually swing back to common sense.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I'd go back to. If I went to university tomorrow, I'd go back to the common sense school and just let's
Mm-hmm. No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Yeah. And I hope we can follow up at a later point.
well, I hope that all made sense and it was a pleasure talking to you.